the organizations for which he worked for. So he worked for the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. Names disappeared from that organization. He worked for an economic think tank at Tsinghua University, one of China's top universities.
But he did make the mistake of criticizing Xi Jinping semi-publicly, didn't he?
What appears to have happened is on an internal group, like a messaging group between academics, he's made some very politic comments about Xi Jinping, not just about his economic policies, but also about his mortality, because of course there's constant speculation about the health of Xi Jinping. That appears to have got him in trouble. Talk about someone who's a very senior economic advisor, someone who will have had access to the top echelons of the leadership in China, somebody whose advice will have been taken. And even if he can disappear, even if it's difficult for him to speak honestly and openly within a small group of friends, that gives you an indication of just how cautious people have to be in order to not run foul of the leadership in China.
And what about the health of the Chinese economy then? Clearly, some part of the criticism was about the way that Xi is running the economy.
Yeah, the criticism of Xi generally and broadly is that he's inflexible. He's not really suited to the 21st century. He's still harking back to a day of Mao Zedong when state-run enterprises were given the most resources, and well, there were no private enterprises then, but he's gone back to that to a certain extent, where loans, for example, from state-run banks will go to state-run industries rather than newer industries, innovative industries and companies which might generate more money for the Chinese economy in the years to come. Over the last few years, the economy has performed well, but not as well as it was doing at the beginning of the century. At the time Xi Jinping came in, there was a lot of hope that he was going to reform. If anything, he's gone backwards. He's gone back to an age which Chinese people thought they'd see the back of forever. And so not only has he turned out not to be reformist, he's gone backwards, and perhaps backwards in terms of political liberalization. There's never been a lot of that in China. But in the early part of this century, there was a small wiggle room for people to criticize, for people to develop businesses and say things around the edges. All that's gone.
Is it part of a pattern? I mean, leading figures in economic life in particular, just, being knocked down, disappearing, jailed, whatever?
Well, it has happened before, most famously with Jack Ma, who at one point was China's richest man, a tycoon, brought himself up, self-made man who perhaps thought, because of his wealth, because of his influence, because of the money he generated for the Chinese economy, he could say what he wanted to. And so a few years ago, he criticized China's financial reform. Very quickly, he was brought down back to earth. I think his finance company was about to list on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange. That was suddenly cancelled. No explanation as to why that would happen. He disappeared for a time. He's reappeared, but...
He's a broken man, though,
He's a broken man. He spends a lot of time, I believe, now outside of China in Japan, but he certainly isn't vocal in any way, shape or form like he was before. If he can be silenced very, very easily, then who's going to speak out? Who's going to be able to say things to Xi Jinping? Nobody would dare to do that.
Mickey Bristow, the BBC World Service Asia Pacific editor. Even worse in terms of death and displacement than Gaza, but mostly ignored in the outside world, the appalling war in Sudan grinds on. The United Nations Secretary General, Antonio Guterres.
And this is more than a conflict between two warring parties. It is a war being waged on the Sudanese people.
At its heart is a personal grudge. General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, Sudan's de facto ruler, had a falling out with his deputy, who's known as Hemeti. Al-Burhan commands the army. Hemeti has control of the paramilitary Rapid Support Forces, or RSF. Their personal dispute has led to livelihoods, and there are now fears of a major famine. Sam the editorial lead for Africa at BBC Monitoring. He spoke to me from Nairobi.
The consensus is that none of the two warring parties has the upper hand. The UN has been saying for quite a while now, John, that this is the world's worst humanitarian crisis. Since the war broke out in April of last year, an estimated half of the Sudanese population, about 24 to 25 million people, have been displaced. A huge number of those have moved out of the country into neighboring South Sudan. There's the Central African Republic and Chad and Ethiopia as well. But there's a huge number, millions, tens of millions of people who are displaced in the country. In Darfur, for example, in the west of Sudan, where millions of people are displaced, the army has been reluctant to allow humanitarian organizations to operate there because they're fearful that the rapid support forces will use the entry of humanitarian aid to smuggle in weapons and other military logistical support. So it's quite a complicated situation just because of, one, the scale of the fighting and the displacement, secondly, the damage to the infrastructure, but also the politics around who controls what.
And in Khartoum itself, what is life like? How difficult is it?
About 80% of the hospitals throughout Sudan, but most of this being in Khartoum itself, but also in Darfur, over 80% of medical facilities are not operating. But also apart from that, there's a complete breakdown of public services. The government has not been functioning for over 17 months now. There's no school for children, but also beyond that, there's very limited basic items that you can go and buy. But even then, you have to dodge airstrikes and potential attacks by the rapid support forces as well.
It started out as a rivalry between one man and his deputy. Is it still the case?
It was essentially a falling out between two men, the generals who have been at the control of this country since the oust of Omar al-Bashir in April 2019. The reason why they started fighting is because the army was demanding that the rapid support forces had to disband as a paramilitary group and join the army. And Hemeti was not sure that his group will survive within the army. But since the war has been going on, John, we've seen the conflict evolve into something that has taken on ethnic dimensions. So in Darfur in particular, the RSF and allied groups, which are predominantly Arab groups that have been targeted, the black ethnic groups there, they've been talked by the ICC as well as Amnesty International Human Rights Watch. That what has happened in Darfur, specifically the targeting of the Masalit, which is a black ethnic group, will constitute what could be considered genocide. But then the other ethnic dimension to this has been the army has also attracted backing from groups, especially in the north and the east of the country, that are quite powerful, but also ethnic armed groups that have come in to say we are going to stand with the army to fight the RSF as well. And so that has raised fears that essentially the country could split in the middle with the groups with the RSF and the ethnic groups in the west of the country favoring the idea of having their own civilian administration, but also then on the east, the army retaining the backing of those powerful ethnic groups on that side.
What success, if any, has there been for the desire to get the parties together and talk it through and find a solution?
So Saudi Arabia and the United States have from the onset been very vocal on trying to find a peaceful solution to the war. There have been rounds, all of them held in Saudi Arabia until the last one in August that was in Switzerland, Geneva, Switzerland. That round that was held in Switzerland was a bit of a disaster in my view because the Sudanese army boycotted it completely. And so that again ended without any clear way forward. What has happened since then, a lot of rhetoric by both the two generals of Burhan and Hemeti saying they think the only solution is to win on the battleground. I don't see any peace initiative that offers hope that there could be a peaceful resolution anytime soon.
Sam Murunga from BBC Monitoring, speaking to me from Nairobi. A former Prime Minister of Israel once said to me that his country's main problem was that it always saw things tactically and didn't worry about the strategic long term. He must be thinking exactly that now. The current Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, has succeeded way beyond most people's expectations. And although his Gaza campaign has been hugely divisive in the wider world and pretty divisive inside Israel as well, Mr. Netanyahu has switched everyone's attention away from the suffering in Gaza. But the question of Israel's future remains. Once upon a time, virtually the whole Western world gave its full support to Israel because it was a small, beleaguered outpost of democracy in a menacing region. Nowadays, though most European countries still basically support Israel, especially after the savagery of the 7th of October attacks from Gaza, the tactics the Israelis have followed have caused criticism and often revulsion throughout the West. What Europe does or says doesn't much matter compared with the United States, and President Biden has been an old-fashioned Democratic Party ally of Israel, but neither Kamala Harris nor even Donald Trump support Israel to the same extent, and attitudes are changing in America, especially among the young. An opinion poll last December indicated that more than 50% of young Americans thought Israel should simply be handed over to the Palestinians. For a long time now, Mr. Netanyahu has been doing exactly what the United States asks him not to do. And yes, he's been pretty successful, but offending and humiliating his greatest ally again and again is problematic. And maybe the time will come when Israel isn't so successful and so dominant, and it'll need friends badly. Well, thank you for joining the Unspun team and me for this edition. Until we meet again, goodbye.
BBC programmes and podcasts, so you may have exploring the arts, culture and music from around the world.
I create work with natural materials like driftwood or sand. My studio is the beach.
I like writing about creepy people and weird people and strange families and odd houses. Performing live when it's in the right environment, something that I can really kind of lose myself in, and I love that.
Arts, music and culture from the BBC World Service. At bbcworldservice.com, the documentary.
At the moment, Jakarta is the fastest sinking city in the world.
Hello, I'm Astu Destra Ajeng Rastri. Join me for Saving a Sinking City, Jakarta, here on the BBC World Service.
The newsroom is next. This is the BBC World Service, the world's radio station. At 4 hours GMT, welcome to the newsroom from the BBC World Service. I'm Charlotte Gallagher. Beirut is rocked again by Israeli airstrikes. We ask how people there are coping.
So they haven't slept properly for a week because the sound of those explosions, the fear of what might come next is having a real impact on people.
Donald Trump is back in the city where he survived an assassination attempt.
For 16 harrowing seconds during the gunfire, time stopped as this vicious monster unleashed pure evil from his sniper's perch.
We'll get the latest from our correspondent there. And did a real president copy a fictional one?
We believe in freedom of speech for everybody.
We're for freedom of speech everywhere.
We believe in freedom to worship for everybody.
We're for freedom to worship everywhere.
All that to come in the next 30 minutes. First, the news bulletin.
Hello, I'm David Harper with the BBC News. Large explosions have again rocked the south of Beirut, Hezbollah bastion, after another day of Israeli strikes on Lebanon. Local media described the blasts as very violent, saying ambulances rushed to affected sites. Anna Foster is in Beirut.
The Lebanese, there were some early suggestions that it might have hit a petrol station, a gas station, because there is one there in that area. Whether or not that was the target, I mean, we don't know. It may be that a building nearby was the target, but there have also been some secondary flashes here, what look like secondary explosions. So again, some people saying perhaps that may have some sort of weapon storage area and hit. At the moment, it's too early to say what it was. How that explosion was.
Israeli warplanes and bombers in central Gaza, killing at least 18 people, according to Palestinian media reports. The official Palestinian news agency said dozens of other people were wounded. Charlotte Paniagolo reports.
The Israeli military says it's used a pinpoint strike to destroy Hamas command centers that it alleges were operating from the mosque in Deir al-Bala near the Al-Aqsa hospital. It had warned it would use considerable force against fighters there. The Israeli account can't be verified, but Israel doesn't allow international the facility is housing displaced civilians and of near Jabalia in northern Gaza. Trump has returned to the site in Butler-Castle despite an assassination attempt in July, addressing the crowd from behind armed Palestinians. Presidential candidate described the suspected assassin as a vicious monster who had unleashed evil. Trump urged his supporters to declare him victory in this election.
Tonight I return to Butler in the aftermath of tragedy and heartache to deliver a simple message to the people of Pennsylvania.
The Democratic Republic of Congo has launched the first Mpox vaccination campaign in Goma in the east. The ceremony at a local hospital marked the start of vaccinations, with the focus on mainstream of further courses. The campaign, targeting high-risk groups, will expand across the region from Monday. Dr. Anne Lemoyne is a member of the Mpox Emergency Committee under the World Health Organization. She told the BBC that certain challenges remain ahead of the rollout of vaccines across the country.
It's not just about getting vaccines someplace, it's getting those vaccines and here